The sun had not yet risen when the river moaned. It was a damp, drawn-out moan, as if the earth itself were lamenting in secret. Between the banks covered in mud and exposed roots, a straw basket floated, swaying with the gentle current, like a secret that did not want to be discovered. Inside it, wrapped in thin cloth stained with dried blood, a baby was crying, the kind of cry that did not ask for help, but confessed abandonment. No bird sang, no boat moved, only the sound of crying, cutting through the silence with the force of someone who, even without understanding the world, has already been rejected by it. The girl had no name. She had no blessing. She carried the invisible weight of being unwanted, given over to the water as an offering of fear. Perhaps whoever left her there believed they were cleansing the house of honor. Perhaps they thought her life would have no color or destiny. But the river did not want to kill her. It carried her slowly, cradling that fragile body as if to say, "You still have something to accomplish." And as the sun rose, a ray of light touched the baby's face, revealing her closed eyes and her half-open mouth, seeking the warmth she had never known. There on the opposite bank, among the vines and dry leaves, a heron stretched its neck and stood still, like a sentinel of destiny. And that was when the fisherman appeared. Silent since birth, he walked with firm steps on the wet earth. His bare feet made no sound. His soul did. When he saw the basket, he did not scream. He simply knelt down, took the girl out of the water, and held her to his chest, as if receiving a sentence and a miracle at the same time. He had no children. He had no voice. But at that moment, he held something that the entire world had rejected, a life. As the fisherman returned to the village with the basket in his arms, the river continued its course. The trees began to move again. The day had truly begun. But something had changed, because on that silent morning, the pain of profound abandonment found, without promises, the beginning of a story that still did not know its end. And even without a name, even without a hug, even without a whispered prayer at her birth, the girl from the river already carried a destiny greater than the pain itself. She survived. And survival, sometimes, is the first miracle that no one sees. The house where she grew up was made of thick clay and crooked wood, with holes in the walls through which the wind blew sorrows that no one could hear. It was a poor house, like so many others, but what hurt there was not the lack of food or comfort. It was a constant presence of a look that said, "You shouldn't be here." The fisherman's sister, a woman with a hard face and sharp words, had accepted to raise a girl, as if accepting a burden that could not be refused. From an early age, she had been told that she was a daughter of the water, an unlucky child, a curse fallen from the wrong sky. When she cried, they said it was a river inside her wanting to take someone else. The fisherman, even with his silence, tried to protect her with small gestures. He shared the most tender fish with her, carefully sewed her clothes, sat close to her at night, just so she wouldn't sleep alone. But there were things that not even silent love could prevent. The village was small, and sharp tongues grew faster than shoots on dry land. "That girl brings disease," they murmured. "She is the daughter of a spell." She learned to walk looking at the ground, with her shoulders hunched, as if she could disappear from the sight of those who feared her. Her bare feet knew where not to step. Her mouth knew when to keep quiet. And her eyes began to hide everything. Her childhood was a time without parties, without names embroidered on fabric, without stories told before bed. Only the tinkling of the wood fire, the smell of the clay pot, and the cruel whispers that slipped through the cracks in the doors. And when she grew up a little, what she heard didn't change. "You are a mistake." That was how she learned to wash clothes in the river with her callous hands, and to wait for the day to pass without wishing for it to arrive. There was no affection, only the dry routine of someone who lives to pay for something they never did. But even there, amidst the mud and roughness, there was something that no one saw. There was a silence inside her that was not empty. It was a silence of resistance, of someone who, even without knowing how, insists on existing. And when the nights came, she would curl up in her corner, holding the worn cloth she used as a blanket, and think about what it would be like to hear someone say, "You belong," not as comfort, but as truth, because up until then, all she had learned was how to survive. And surviving, day after day, in a place where affection was rationed like water in a drought, was also a form of courage. She wanted to learn. That was her first mistake. They said, a girl like her should be content with silence, with the shadow of others, with the fate she was given, as if wanting more were a sin. But she wanted to. She wanted to understand the letters she saw scribbled on the school walls. She wanted to hold a pencil, as if it were a secret. She wanted to sit in the classroom, even if it was in the back, even if it was silent. And for that, she paid. The laughter began softly, first from her classmates, who made fun of her smell of smoke and old soap, her clothes that were always worn the same way, her hair tied up with sewing thread. Then came the teacher. One of them, with impatient eyes, tore up her notebook in front of class and said, "This is no place for a mute fisherman's daughter." She swallowed her shame as if it were dust. Every attempt to learn was a crack that closed tightly. And every time she went home, it was as if she were carrying a stone on her shoulders that no one saw. Unable to continue her studies, she went to work. She washed pots and pans in the kitchen of a warehouse. From morning until dusk, the cold water hurt her hands, but it was the muffled laughter of the other employees that cut her the most. She doesn't talk. She doesn't think. She just washes. And yet she listened. She heard everything, and she kept it all in. At the end of the day, she would sit in a corner with her feet on the cold ground and look up at the sky as if asking if there was any place where someone like her could be more than a mistake. Time passed, and hope slowly dried up like a forgotten well in a drought. She was no longer a girl, but she was also no longer a woman in the eyes of others. She was a shadow, a useful but unwanted presence, a name that no one said out loud. And yet she continued, not out of stubbornness, but because of something that not even she understood. Maybe it was a silent desire to one day hear someone say, "You have value." Until then, every door she had knocked on had closed in anger, but there was something inside her that would not be silenced, something that still whispered, even weakly, even hurt, that life, somehow, could be more than pain. He was always there, as if he were part of the square, as if the wooden bench had grown with him sitting on it. An old man with a wrinkled face and a fixed gaze, who watched the movement of the village with eyes that seemed to listen more than see. He never smiled. He never spoke. He just stood there, with a straw hat and a dark wooden staff resting at his side, as if waiting for something that time had not yet brought. To many, he was just a harmless madman, a shadow among the trees. To her, he was the only one who never looked away. She passed him every day on her way back from work. Smeared with grease and sadness, she walked in silence, and he just looked at her, without pity, without contempt. He just looked. It was the first look that didn't hurt. One day, when she arrived at the square, she found the bench empty. In the place where he usually sat, there was a notebook with a blue cover and a pen tied with a thin string. At the top of the first page, a sentence written in shaky handwriting, "Write your pain." She looked around. No one, only the wind moving the pages, as if the whole world was waiting for her to choose. She took the notebook home without knowing why. She touched the pen as if it were something sacred, something forbidden. And that night, for the first time, she wrote. They couldn't read her words, but she could feel them. She wrote what she had never said. The pain of being called a curse, the shame in front of the blackboard, the tiredness of her hands cracked by the dirty water. She wrote as if she were pouring out a fever, as if she were bleeding from ink, and she slept with the notebook next to her, as if she were embracing something that finally understands her silence. The next morning, he was there, sitting still with the stick in his lap. She walked past him with the same look in her eyes as always, but this time there was something more, an invisible thread between them. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. But when their eyes met, it was as if they were saying together, "Now it begins," because sometimes all it takes is a gesture, and a gaze that doesn't waver, for the soul to finally find a place to listen. The nights became longer, but not darker. Under the yellow light of a crooked candle, she wrote. Each word came out from within like someone pulling out thorns that had been stuck there for years. She didn't write to show off. She didn't write to heal. She wrote because, finally, she had found a place where her pain fit in its entirety. The sheets of paper piled up under the bed, hidden in an old shoebox, like relics of a soul that no one saw. There were her secrets, her memories, her silent revolt, everything that the world told her to keep quiet. And over time, those words began to take the form of poetry, not because she wanted them to, but because there was something in her pain that danced with language, even when she didn't know the steps. Her verses didn't have perfect rhymes or precise meters, but they had truth, they had blood. They had that mixture of anguish and hope that only those who have been left behind understand. She wrote about the girl in the river, about the mud house, about the silence that doesn't kill, but also doesn't let you live. And each sentence seemed to give her back a piece that had been taken away. One day, she dropped one of those sheets in the square. The wind blew it away, and she didn't see it. She only realized when she got home and felt that something was missing. She looked for it, but couldn't find it. She stood still for hours, wondering who could have read it. She felt fear, shame, and almost burned it all. But that same night, she wrote again, because writing was no longer a choice. It was survival. It was her only way to breathe in a world that told her to drown in silence. The girl no one could hear was now screaming, not with her mouth, but with her hands. Her words were daggers and bridges. They were dried tears transformed into ink. And even though no one knew her name there, among crumpled papers and torn dreams, she was reborn, word by word, scar by scar, like someone who plants flowers in the same soil that once bore only thorns. It was a late afternoon like any other, with the sky tinged with orange and dust, when the teacher found a sheet of paper. He was walking distractedly, returning from the school where he taught literature, when he saw the paper stuck to the root of a tree, as if the wind had carried it there on purpose. He read it standing up, his eyes narrowing with each line. It was an unsigned poem, verses written with the urgency of someone who is bleeding and healing at the same time. There was something in that text that could not be explained, an old pain, an unvarnished truth. He folded the sheet of paper carefully, as if holding something sacred, and took it home. That same night, she published an excerpt in the local newspaper, with no name, no context, just the words. The next day, the whole village was talking. Who wrote this? It was as if everyone had sensed something, without knowing where it came from. Some said it was from a foreign writer. Others, that it was an old man hiding among the palm trees. No one imagined that it came from the girl who washed pots, who crossed the square in silence, with the eyes of someone who had seen more than she should. And when she heard people reciting her verses out loud, she felt a new fear, the fear of being seen. But along with her fear came a tremor she had never known, recognition. Someone had heard her. Someone had felt her. For the first time, her pain was touching other hearts. She began to write more. She hid the pages in the same place. And the teacher, without ever knowing who she was, kept finding them. He published the excerpts on the school bulletin board, on the community radio, even in letters sent beyond the village. The invisible voice of African suffering, they said. A pretty name for a faceless author. But for her, it was enough to know that her pain was no longer an echo lost in the void. And when one clear morning a national broadcaster mentioned her verses live, something changed forever. The village stopped. Children listened in silence. Adults looked at each other. And she, hidden behind a wooden door of her house, cried. She cried because, finally, someone said out loud what she had always known. Pain can be a bridge. And even though no one yet knew her name, the world was beginning to listen. And listening, for someone who had always been ignored, is already a miracle. The first time her name was called into the microphone, she hesitated. It was a school in another village, where young people gathered to hear about art and resistance. The teacher had recognized her, not by her clothes, not by her face, but by her handwriting. And when she finally discovered who the voice behind the words was, she had no doubts. The world needed to hear her. She stepped onto the small wooden stage as if treading sacred ground. Her knees trembled, but her voice, although fragile, came from a firm, ancient, deep place. She spoke little. She read excerpts. She told fragments of her story. And the silence that took over the room was different. Not the silence of contempt, but of full listening. At the end, there was applause, but what touched her most was a hug from a girl who whispered, "You said what I could never say." From then on, invitations came. Universities, radio stations, cultural events. In each place, she repeated the same words with new emotion. She was not looking for fame. She was looking to share. She knew that her pain was also shared by many. And when her story reached the UN at a meeting on youth and expression, her name became a symbol. But she never forgot where she came from. She always returned to the square, to the bench, to the river. Her speeches were not those of an expert. They were those of a survivor. She spoke of the girl with no name, of the forgotten notebook, of the old man who never spoke but taught us to listen. In her lectures, she brought more than poems. She brought gestures, rituals, stories of women who sewed courage with the threads of rejection. She founded small writing groups in the outskirts of the city. She taught how to transform pain into art, abandonment into a path, silence into speech. And what moved her most was not being on stage, but in the simple circles where young people sat on the floor with pencils and paper and discovered, as she once discovered, that there is beauty in what has been torn apart, that dignity can be reborn between words spoken with truth. the girl from the river, was now a master of listening. And every time someone said to her, "Thank you for telling me what I experienced," she understood that her purpose was not to be celebrated, but to sow relief where before there was only pain. Because there are pains are silenced, and there are others that, when spoken, free all who listen. Years had passed, but the path was still the same. The stones, the damp smell of the forest, the sound of the river whispering secrets that no one could decipher anymore. She returned, not alone. Dozens of young people came with her, and then hundreds, with blank sheets of paper in their hands and eyes hungry for expression. They arrived in silence, as if in a ritual. The place where she had almost died one day was now preparing to be born again. On the riverbank, among crooked trunks and ancient roots, she placed her bare feet on the earth and felt the entire time passing through her skin. Right there, facing the water that once tried to sweep her away, she opened a school without walls, with a roof made of branches and a floor made of memories. She baptized the space with a name she had invented on her own, as if she were giving back to the land in a gesture of gratitude. Nkimi writing and listening center. It was more than a name. It was a promise that no child from then on would have to scream without being heard. The benches were carved by local artisans. The walls were decorated with poems written by those who previously only knew how to keep quiet. And in the middle of the open square, the bench, the same bench where the old man used to sit, now with his name engraved with a knife as a testament. At the opening ceremony, there was no speech. She simply sat on the bench, looked at the river, and waved with moist eyes. A small child ran and sat beside her, then another, and another. Within minutes, she was surrounded by new, curious, light voices. That was what she wanted, for the place of pain to become a cradle of hope, for the branches that once hid abandonment to now embrace life, for the water that carried the basket to now wash the feet of those who walk with dignity. And on that warm afternoon, with drums in the background and leaves falling like blessings from the sky, she knew the girl that the river almost took had returned to heal what was left, not with revenge, but with presence, not with shouting, but with construction. Because some stories do not end where the pain begins. They come back, they are rewritten, they are replanted, and they bloom, even on the banks of the same river, under the same sky, but now with a different destiny. Atop a small wooden plaque set into the center's entrance, the words were carefully carved. Nkimi Art and Memory Center, where silence became voice. And there, in that sentence, was everything. It was no longer about pain. It was about remembrance, about turning what hurt into a foundation, about not forgetting what happened, but using it as the root for everything that now rises. She walked slowly through the space she had helped build, touching the pages hanging on clotheslines, poems, drawings, single words, all from young people who, like her, had learned to speak without asking permission. In the background, children ran along the riverbank. They laughed loudly. Some got their feet wet. Others imitated the scene with the basket, pretending to float. And she, sitting again on the bench with her name carved into it, looked at everything with a smile that came from far away. It was the same river, the same curve, the same smell of clay and hope. But now, instead of carrying abandonment, it carried memory. Instead of silence, he heard songs. And in that moment, she was no longer just a girl from the river. She was a guardian. She was a bridge. She was a living reminder that no life begins and ends in pain. She closed her eyes for a moment. The wind blew softly, bringing with it an ancient sound, like the laughter of someone who left too soon, or the blessing of an ancestor watching from afar. She took a deep breath, touched the ground with her fingers. Then she stood up. She walked to the riverbank. And there, before the waters that had once almost swept away everything, she made a simple gesture. She opened her arms, not to ask, but to give thanks, because now, finally, she knew her life had been worth it, not because it had been easy, but because, despite everything, she had chosen a plant where before there had been only emptiness. She stood there motionless before the river that had once been a cradle and a threat, and was now a mirror of all that had blossomed. Around her, the laughter of children mingled with the gentle song of the current, as if the water itself were celebrating its redemption. With her feet firmly on the ground and her heart at peace, she whispered something that only her ancestors had heard. Then she slowly bent down, picked up a handful of earth, and threw it back into the river, as if sealing a pact between the past and the future. Nothing else needed to be said, because in that simple and complete gesture was engraved what the entire world needed to remember. She floated in the river of death, but she chose to live. And those who choose to live like this with dignity transform even pain into an eternal name. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive more stories of pain that turned into rebirth. Leave your like. It shows that the voice of overcoming needs to echo. Comment below which part of this journey spoke to your soul the most, and share this video with someone who needs to remember that even silence can blossom